10,000 years is a long time to wait for revenge. But the Valori were a patient species. High Matriarch Sylvana stood at the window of her chamber and looked out at the great city below, her scales shimmering in the golden light of the twin suns that hung over Vilar Prime. She had lived for 3,000 years, and she remembered the stories her grandmother had told her about the conquest of the little blue world called Earth. The humans had been such simple creatures back then, fighting each other with swords made of iron and arrows tipped with stone. They had built their homes from mud and wood, and they had worshipped gods they could not see. When the Valori warships descended from the clouds, the humans had thought their gods had come to punish them. The conquest took only 3 days. Plasma lances turned their stone castles into pools of molten glass and their wooden villages into ash. The humans screamed and ran and died in numbers too large to count. Those who survived fell to their knees and begged for mercy in languages the Valori did not bother to learn. The Valori could have killed them all, but what would be the point of that? A dead species could not serve, could not work, could not provide entertainment for their conquerors. So instead of destruction, the Valori chose something else entirely. They chose to wait. The truce of submission was a simple agreement that the humans had no choice but to accept. Humanity would be left alone on their little world for exactly 10,000 years. They would not be contacted, visited, or interfered with in any way. And when the 10,000 years ended, the Valori would return to claim Earth as a colony and its people as servants. The humans agreed because they had no other option. They knelt in the ashes of their burned cities, and they accepted the terms of their future slavery. The Valori recorded the agreement, placed warning beacons around the Sol system, and departed for their long sleep among the stars. Now, 10,000 years later, the waiting was finally over. Ambassador Kethvora walked through the great hall of the Galactic Assembly with her head held high and her claws clicking against the polished floor. Representatives from dozens of species watched her pass, their many eyes following her with expressions she could not read. The assembly was the closest thing the galaxy had to a government, a place where species came together to trade and talk, and occasionally threaten each other. The Valori had been members for 60,000 years, longer than most species had existed. They were respected, feared, and never questioned. Kethvora reached the central platform and activated the holographic display. A blue and green world appeared in the air above her, spinning slowly in the projected light. "Distinguished representatives," she began, her voice carrying across the silent chamber, "I come before you today to announce the formal end of the truce of submission between the Valori Dominion and the species known as humanity." Murmurs rippled through the assembly. Kethvora smiled, showing rows of needle-sharp teeth. 10,000 years ago, our ancestors encountered a primitive species on a small world in an unremarkable system. These creatures called themselves humans. They fought with sticks and stones. They died by the millions when our forces arrived, and they surrendered within 3 rotations of their planet. She gestured at the hologram, and images appeared showing medieval humans fleeing from Valori soldiers, their faces twisted with terror. "We granted them mercy. We gave them time. We allowed them to continue existing when we could have erased them from the universe. And now, as agreed, we return to collect what is ours." The Valori Armada was already on its way. 200 dreadnoughts, each one large enough to block out a sun. 50,000 support vessels carrying soldiers, weapons, and the equipment needed to establish colonial rule. It was more firepower than necessary for conquering a single primitive world. But the Valori believed in overwhelming force. Kethvora looked around the chamber, expecting to see approval, or at least acceptance. Instead, she saw something strange in the eyes of the other representatives. Something that looked almost like pity. "Is there a problem?" she asked. A small creature from a species called the Fanari raised one of its many limbs. Its voice was high and nervous when it spoke. "Ambassador, are you certain the humans are still as you remember them?" HFY laughed, a harsh sound like metal scraping against stone. "What else would they be? They are short-lived creatures with fragile bodies and limited intelligence. Even if they have advanced somewhat, they cannot possibly pose a threat to Valori military power. We have been conquering worlds since before their species learned to walk upright." The Funari representative lowered its limb and said nothing more. But HFY noticed that several other species were looking at each other with expressions she did not understand. The assembly voted to acknowledge the end of the truce, as they were required to do. There were no objections, no protests, no attempts to intervene. The Valori were too powerful to oppose, and besides, what did it matter if one primitive species was conquered? As HFY left the chamber, she passed by a delegation she had not noticed before. They wore simple gray uniforms and stood with a stillness that seemed almost military. Their faces were flat, their eyes forward, their expressions completely blank. "Who are those?" she asked her aide. The aide consulted a datapad and hesitated before answering. "They are listed as observers from a minor species. They joined the assembly approximately 3,000 years ago. Their name? They call themselves humans, Ambassador." HFY stopped walking and turned to look at the delegation again. They stood motionless, watching her with eyes that held no fear. One of them, a female with gray hair and a face lined with age, gave her a small nod. "Impossible," HFY whispered. "They cannot be here. They are confined to their world." But the warning beacons had been placed 10,000 years ago. The Valori had been asleep for most of that time, dreaming in their hibernation ships while they waited for the truce to end. They had assumed the humans would stay where they were put. They had assumed wrong. HFY felt something she had not experienced in centuries. A cold sensation that crept up her spine and made her scales stand on end. It was fear. The human delegation turned and walked away without a word, their footsteps echoing in the hall long after they had disappeared from sight. Across the galaxy, the Valori Armada continued its journey toward Earth, its commanders confident in their coming victory. They had no idea that the primitives they remembered had become something else entirely. The humans had spent 10,000 years preparing for this day, and they were ready. Fleet Commander HFY stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched the stars stretch into lines as his armada dropped out of hyperspace. The journey from Velo Prime had taken 6 standard months, and he was eager to begin the conquest the last time Valori ships had entered this system. They had found a single inhabited world orbiting a yellow star. The planet had been covered in green forests and blue oceans, and the primitive creatures who lived there had posed no challenge. What Silveriath expected to find the same thing today, Commander, his sensor officer called out. "We are detecting some unusual readings." "Define unusual." "There appear to be structures in orbit around the 4th planet." HFY walked to the sensor station and looked at the display. What he saw made no sense at all. Mars, the red desert world that had been completely dead 10,000 years ago, was surrounded by thousands of artificial objects. Lights glittered across its surface like stars reflected in a blood-red sea. "That cannot be correct," he said. "Check your equipment." "I have checked it 3 times, Commander. The readings are accurate." Before HFY could respond, another officer shouted from across the bridge. "Commander, we are detecting weapons platforms throughout the asteroid belt. I count over 10,000 individual installations. Impossible. There are also shipyards around the 3rd planet, massive ones, and orbital habitats, and defense stations. Commander, this system is heavily fortified." HFY felt his heart begin to beat faster. This was not what he had been told to expect. This was not what the ancient records described. Something had gone terribly wrong. "Hail the nearest structure," he ordered. Demand to know who has invaded the human system. The communications officer sent the transmission and waited. The response came almost immediately, and it was not what anyone on the bridge expected. A human face appeared on the main view screen. She was a female of advanced age, with dark eyes and silver hair cut short in a military style. She wore a gray uniform covered with medals and insignia that Yethrul did not recognize. Behind her, he could see other humans working at stations filled with technology that looked nothing like the crude tools his ancestors had described. "This is Admiral Chen Wei of the United Terran Navy," the human said. "You have entered sovereign human space. State your intentions." Yethrul stared at the screen in disbelief. The humans were supposed to be primitive. They were supposed to be farmers and hunters, living in huts made of animal skin. They were not supposed to have admirals or navies or military uniforms. "I am Fleet Commander Yethrul of the Valori Dominion," he replied, struggling to keep his voice steady. "I have come to enforce the terms of the truce of submission. Your species agreed to accept Valori rule when the 10,000 years ended." Admiral Chun's expression did not change. She looked at him with eyes that held no fear, no confusion, and no respect. "We are aware of the agreement our ancestors made," she said. "They had no choice. Your ships burned our cities and killed our people. They knelt because it was the only way to survive. Then you understand that you must kneel again." No. The single word hung in the air between them. Yethrul had never been refused before. No species had ever dared to say no to the Valori. "You do not have a choice," he said. "My armada carries enough firepower to reduce your world to molten rock. You will surrender, or you will die." Admiral Chun leaned forward slightly, and for the first time, something like emotion crossed her face. It was not fear. It was something harder, something colder. "Commander, let me explain something to you. Your ancestors attacked our world when we were still learning how to forge steel. They killed millions of innocent people who had no way to defend themselves. They forced the survivors to bow down and accept slavery." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was quiet but filled with a weight that Yethrul could feel across the void of space. "We never forgot what was done to us. Every generation, we told our children about the 3 days of fire. We built monuments to the dead. We swore that we would never be helpless again. And then we started building. Building what? Everything? Ships, weapons, armies, alliances. We reached the stars 3,000 years ago. We joined the galactic community. We learned everything we could about every species we encountered. And we prepared." Yethrul looked at his tactical display. His 200 dreadnoughts suddenly seemed very small compared to the thousands of weapons platforms that surrounded them. He could see human warships moving into position, sleek vessels that looked nothing like the clumsy first attempts at spaceflight that most young species produced. "You have been preparing for us," he realized. "For 10,000 years, Admiral Chun confirmed. Every advance we made, every technology we developed, every soldier we trained. It was all for this moment. We knew you would come back. We knew you would expect to find the same helpless creatures you conquered before." She smiled, and there was no warmth in it. "We wanted you to be surprised." The first Valori dreadnought exploded without warning. One moment it was there. The next, it was an expanding cloud of fire and debris. Yethrul had not even seen the weapon that destroyed it. "That was the righteous fury," Admiral Chun said. "It was crewed by 3,000 of your soldiers. I am sorry for their deaths, but I want you to understand something important." "What?" "We did not fire first. Your ship powered its weapons and targeted one of our defense platforms. We simply responded faster than you expected. We will always respond. We will never stop responding. And we will never, ever surrender." Yethrul looked at the burning wreckage of his dreadnought and felt the fear that had been growing in his chest turned into something close to terror. This was not a conquest. This was a trap. And his entire fleet had walked right into it. "What do you want?" he asked. "Right now, I want you to retreat. Take your fleet and go back to your masters. Tell them what you found here. Tell them that the humans they remember no longer exist. And if I refuse..." Admiral Chun looked at him with those cold, dark eyes. "Then you will join the crew of the Righteous Fury. And I will deliver the message myself." Yethrul ordered the retreat. It was the first time in Valori history that a fleet had turned back from a conquest. It would not be the last. As his ships fled toward the edge of the system, he looked back at the blue world called Earth. It was beautiful, even now. Perhaps especially now the humans had waited 10,000 years for this day, and they had made the most of every single one of them. High Matriarch Sylvana listened to Commander Yethrul's report in complete silence. When he finished speaking, she sat motionless on her throne for a long time, her ancient eyes staring at nothing. "Tell me again," she finally said. "How many ships did we lose?" 47 dreadnoughts, Matriarch. Over 200 support vessels. Approximately 150,000 soldiers. And how many did we destroy in return? Yethrul lowered his head in shame. "None, Matriarch. We did not destroy a single human vessel." The court erupted in shocked whispers. Advisors and generals looked at each other with expressions of disbelief. In 60,000 years of Valori history, such a defeat had never occurred. They were the conquerors of 100 worlds. They had crushed species far more advanced than medieval humans. How could this have happened? Sylvana raised one clawed hand, and the chamber fell silent. She turned to her chief strategist, a scarred veteran named Kethmara, who had won 17 major campaigns. "Explain this to me," she commanded. "How did a species of short-lived primitives become capable of defeating our armada?" Kethmara stepped forward, his scales dull with age, but his mind still sharp. "Matriarch, I have spent the last several cycles studying everything we know about humanity. I have analyzed their technology, their tactics, their history, and I believe I understand what happened." "Then speak." "The humans did not merely advance. They transformed. When our ancestors conquered Earth, humanity lived in scattered tribes and small kingdoms. They had no unified government, no shared purpose, no common goal. They fought each other almost as much as they tried to fight us." He activated a holographic display showing Earth as it had been 10,000 years ago, but the conquest changed them. For the first time in their history, all of humanity faced a single enemy. They were united by their defeat, bound together by shared trauma and shared shame. The 3 days of fire became the defining moment of their entire species. The display shifted, showing monuments and memorials scattered across Earth's surface. They built temples to their dead. They wrote songs of mourning that are still sung today. They created holidays dedicated to remembering what we did to them. Every human child learns about the conquest before they learn to read. It is burned into their culture, their identity, their very souls. Sylvana felt a chill run through her ancient body. They never forgot. No, Matriarch. And that is what makes them dangerous. The Valari live for thousands of years. We remember our own experiences, but we do not carry the memories of our ancestors the way humans do. When something happens to us, we eventually move on. We heal. We forget. Kethmara shook his head slowly. Humans are different. They only live for about 100 years, sometimes less. By our standards, they are mayflies, creatures that flicker in and out of existence so quickly that we barely notice them. But they have developed something we do not possess. They've learned to pass their memories to their children. All species teach their young. Not like this. Humans do not simply teach. They remember together. They share their pain across generations through stories and songs and sacred days of mourning. An individual human may live only a century, but humanity as a whole carries wounds that are 10,000 years old. The display changed again, showing human soldiers training with weapons that the Valori had never seen before when we gave them the truce. We thought we were giving them time to accept their fate. We assumed that after a few generations, the memory of the conquest would fade. They would become docile, compliant, ready to serve. Instead, they used every single day to prepare for our return. They knew we would come back. They knew they had 10,000 years, and they refused to waste a single moment. Cathmara pulled up images of human shipyards, weapons factories, and military academies. They reached their moon within a few hundred years of our departure. They reached Mars a century after that. They developed faster than light travel 3,000 years ago and began colonizing other systems. Today, there are almost 1 trillion humans spread across dozens of worlds. Sylvana leaned forward on her throne. Why did no one tell us? We were asleep, matriarch. Our hibernation ships were drifting between the stars, waiting for the truce to end. And the other species of the galaxy were afraid to interfere. They saw what the humans were building, and they understood what it meant. What does it mean? Cathmara met her eyes with a gaze that held no hope. It means we are facing a species that has spent 10,000 years doing nothing but preparing to fight us. Every technology they developed, every alliance they formed, every soldier they trained, it was all aimed at one goal: defeating the Valori. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the court. We thought they were weak because they die quickly. We were wrong. Their short lives make them desperate, determined, driven. They know they do not have centuries to solve their problems, so they solve them in decades or even years. They adapt faster than any species we have ever encountered. Can we defeat them? Cathmara was silent for a long moment. I do not know, matriarch. They have studied us for 3,000 years. They know our tactics, our weapons, our weaknesses. They have allies across the galaxy, species who see humanity as a shield against Valori expansion. And they have something else, something I do not fully understand. What? Hatred. Not hot hatred, not the kind that burns out quickly. Cold hatred. Patient hatred. The kind that can wait for 10,000 years without cooling by a single degree. They hate us, matriarch. They hate us with a purity and intensity that I have never seen in any other species. Sylvana closed her eyes and thought about what she had done. She had awakened her people from their long sleep, expecting an easy conquest. Instead, she had started a war against an enemy who had been waiting for this fight since before she was born. What do you recommend? She asked Mora bowed his head. Prepare for the worst war in our history, matriarch. The humans will not stop fighting until one of our species is destroyed. They cannot forgive what we did to them. They will not forget. In her private chambers that night, Sylvana stood at her window and looked up at the stars. Somewhere out there, human warships were moving through the darkness, coming closer with every passing moment. She wondered if her grandmother had felt any regret after the conquest of Earth. She wondered if anyone had considered what might happen if the humans survived long enough to become strong. Probably not. The Valori had been too confident, too certain of their own superiority. Now they would pay for that arrogance. The humans were coming, and they remembered everything. Not 11 months of slow progress and careful advances. 11 months of systematic destruction as the United Terran Navy dismantled the Valori Dominion. Piece by piece, Admiral Chunwei stood on the bridge of her flagship, the TNS Remembrance, and watched the tactical display update in real time. Blue markers showed human fleet positions. Red markers showed Valori forces. There were far fewer red markers now than there had been at the start of the war. Admiral, her aide reported, the 7th Fleet has secured the Keth system. All Valori forces have been neutralized. Civilian populations are being evacuated to safe zones. Casualties? Minimal on our side. The Valari garrison surrendered after we destroyed their orbital defenses. Chun nodded. This was how most of the battles had gone. The Valari were powerful, but they had not fought a real war in thousands of years. They had forgotten what it meant to face an enemy who would not surrender. The humans had never forgotten in the first month of the war. Human forces had pushed the Valori completely out of Sol System. In the second month, they had begun attacking Valori supply lines and cutting off reinforcements. By the sixth month, the Dominion had lost half of its territory now. In the 11th month, human ships were entering Valori home space for the first time in history. Chen looked at the image of Valor Prime on her display. It was a beautiful world, covered in golden forests and silver oceans. Two suns hung in its amber sky, casting long shadows across ancient cities that had stood for 60,000 years. Tomorrow, those cities would see something they had never seen before. Enemy ships in their sky, Admiral, her communications officer said. We are receiving a transmission from the Valori High Command. They are requesting a meeting. Put it through. The face of High Matriarch Sylvana appeared on the screen. She looked old in a way that had nothing to do with her 3,000 years of life. Her scales had lost their shine, and her eyes held a weariness that went deeper than exhaustion. Admiral Chun, she said, I am requesting a ceasefire to discuss terms. There is nothing to discuss, Matriarch. You declared war on humanity. You sent your fleets to conquer our worlds. You intended to enslave our people. Did you expect us to negotiate? I expected you to be reasonable, Chun laughed. It was not a pleasant sound, reasonable. 10,000 years ago, your ancestors burned our cities and killed millions of innocent people. They forced our survivors to kneel in the ashes and accept slavery. And when we asked for mercy, they gave us a truce that was nothing more than a delayed death sentence. She leaned forward, her dark eyes boring into the Valori leader. For 10,000 years, we dreamed of this moment. We built everything we have for one purpose: to make sure that no Valori would ever threaten humanity again. And now you want us to be reasonable? What do you want? Sylvana asked. Unconditional surrender. The complete dissolution of the Valori Dominion. The release of all slave species under your control. And reparations for the 3 days of fire. That is extinction. No. Extinction is what you plan for us. What we are offering is defeat. Your species will survive. Your people will live. But your empire will end, and you will never again have the power to threaten another world. The transmission ended, and Chun turned back to her tactical display. The Valari would refuse, of course. They were too proud to surrender without a final battle. But that was fine. The humans were ready. The siege of Valor Prime began at dawn. Human ships dropped out of hyperspace in perfect formation, their weapons already powered and their shields at full strength. They outnumbered the Valori defenders 3-1. And their technology was a century more advanced. The battle lasted 6 hours. Valori dreadnoughts fell one by one. Their ancient hull was no match for human plasma cannons and quantum torpedoes. Defense platforms were destroyed before they could fire a single shot. By noon, the orbital space around Valor Prime was filled with the wreckage of what had once been the mightiest fleet in the galaxy. Admiral Chun watched the final Valori warship explode and felt nothing but cold satisfaction. This was not revenge. Revenge was hot and wild and uncontrolled. This was justice. This was the fulfillment of a promise that had been made 10,000 years ago. Admiral, her aide said quietly, the path to the planet is clear. What are your orders? Chun thought about everything humanity had suffered. She thought about the 3 days of fire, the millions who had died, the generations who had grown up under the shadow of Valori slavery. She thought about what it would feel like to give the order that would end this war forever. "Prepare a shuttle," she said. "I am going down to the surface. It is time to accept their surrender in person." She landed in the central courtyard of the Imperial Palace, flanked by Marines in powered armor that made them look like walking tanks. The palace was ancient, its walls carved with the history of Valori conquests. She wondered how many species had knelt on this very ground, begging for mercy that never came. High Matriarch Sylvana was waiting for her. The old Valori stood alone at the top of the palace steps, her robes blowing in the wind. Above her, human ships hung in the amber sky like dark stars. Around her, Valori citizens watched in terrified silence. "Admiral Chun," she said as Chun approached, "you have won. What happens now? That depends on you, Matriarch. Will you accept our terms?" Sylvana was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. 10,000 years ago, my ancestors stood over your defeated leaders and demanded submission. They thought they were gods, too powerful to ever be challenged. They gave you a truce because they wanted to savor your conquest, to return when you had grown just enough to make the victory interesting. She looked up at the ships in her sky. They never imagined this. They never thought that the primitive creatures they had crushed would one day stand over us and demand the same thing. "Is this your revenge, Admiral? To make us feel what your ancestors felt?" Chun shook her head. "No, Matriarch. If this were revenge, your cities would be burning. Your people would be dying in the streets. I would give you a truce of submission and return in 10,000 years to finish what we started. Then what is this? This is something the Valori have never offered anyone. This is mercy. Accept our terms and your species will survive. Refuse, and we will do what we must. But either way, we will never become what you were." She extended her hand. "The war is over, Matriarch. All you have to do is accept it." Sylvana looked at the human's hand. Such a simple gesture, such a small thing. But she understood what it meant. It meant that the Valori had lost, completely and forever. It meant that the empire her ancestors had built over 60,000 years was ending today. She knelt not because she was forced to, but because she finally understood what her ancestors had never learned. Power is not eternal, and cruelty is not forgotten. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the most powerful being in the Valori, Dominion, bowed her head before a human and across the galaxy. 1,000,000,000,000 humans heard the news and wept with joy. The war was over. They had won. They were free. They would never kneel again. 50 years had passed since the end of the human-Valori war on the former Valori colony world of Thesan. A young historian named Yethvon sat in his small apartment and stared at the document on his screen. He had been working on this study for 5 years, interviewing survivors, reading ancient records, trying to understand how his people had fallen so far so fast. The title of his work was simple: The Long Memory, How Humanity Defeated the Valori Dominion. He read through his conclusion one more time, making sure every word was exactly right. The Valori made a single, catastrophic error, he had written. We assumed that because humans lived short lives, they possessed short memories. We believed that a species that measured existence in decades could not carry purpose across millennia. We were wrong. Humans do not forget. They pass their memories to their children and their children's children, through story and song and stone. They build monuments to their suffering. They write their pain into their very culture. An individual human may live only a century, but humanity's memory is eternal. We gave them 10,000 years to remember what we did to them. 10,000 years to prepare. 10,000 years to become something we could not imagine. The Valori Dominion ruled this galaxy for 60,000 years. It took humanity less than 1 year to end us. Not because they were stronger. Not because they were smarter. but because they remembered, and they refused to let their children forget. Yethvan leaned back in his chair and thought about what those words meant. His grandmother had been a soldier in the war. She had told him stories about the human ships that filled the sky like angry stars, about the precision of their attacks and the terrible efficiency of their victory. She had never spoken with hatred, only with a kind of awe. They could have destroyed us, she had said once near the end of her life. They had every right to. We would have done the same to them. But they chose mercy. I still do not understand why. Yethvan understood now. After 5 years of research, the humans had chosen mercy not because they were weak, but because they were strong. They had proven their power by winning the war. They had proven their character by ending it without genocide. They wanted to show the galaxy that they were better than the Valori. And they had succeeded. He had come to believe. The most human thing about them, he thought about his own childhood. Growing up in a world that had been conquered twice. First by his own ancestors, then by the humans who had liberated it. He had expected to hate the humans, but he did not. How could he hate a species that had freed his people from slavery? The former Valori Dominion was now something called the Cooperative of Free Worlds. It was a loose alliance of species who had once been subjects of Valori rule. The humans did not lead it, but they protected it. Their fleets patrolled its borders, and their diplomats helped resolve its disputes. Some of his people resented this. They said the humans were just another empire waiting to show its true face. Yethvan did not believe that. He had studied the humans too long to think they were capable of such deception. They were exactly what they appeared to be. A species that had been hurt badly, had healed slowly, and had learned from their pain. His study would be published next week. It would be required reading in schools across the former Dominion. Human scholars had already praised it as fair and accurate. Valori elders had criticized it as too sympathetic to the enemy. Yethvan did not care about the critics. He cared about the truth, and the truth was simple. The Valori had created their own destroyers. If they had shown mercy 10,000 years ago, if they had offered friendship instead of slavery, the humans would have become their allies instead of their enemies. But they had chosen cruelty, and cruelty had a price. That price had finally been paid on Earth. The center of human civilization, a great monument stood in the heart of the capital city. It showed a kneeling figure rising to their feet, one fist raised toward the sky. The figure was not clearly male or female, not clearly any race or nation. It represented all of humanity, everyone who had ever suffered under Valori oppression. The inscription at the base read, "Never again." Every year, on the anniversary of the 3 days of fire, millions of humans gathered at this monument to remember. They lit candles for the dead. They sang the old songs of mourning. They told their children the stories of what had happened and what it had cost to survive. Admiral Chen Wei had died 15 years ago, at the age of 93. She had spent her final decades working for peace, helping to build the new galactic order that emerged from the ashes of the Valori Dominion. At her funeral, 1 billion people had watched as her body was carried past the monument she had fought to earn. Her last words had been recorded and played for the crowd. "We won because we remembered," she had said. "We survived because we refused to forget. But now that the war is over, we must learn something new. We must learn to forgive, not for the Valori. They do not deserve our forgiveness, but for ourselves." Carrying hatred for 10,000 years was necessary to survive, but it is not a way to live. We must put down this burden, not because our enemies have earned it, but because we have earned peace. Remember the 3 days of fire. Never let your children forget what was done to us. But do not teach them to hate. Teach them to be strong, to be prepared, to be vigilant. And teach them that true victory is not destroying your enemy. True victory is becoming something better than they could ever be. The crowd had wept. and the candles had flickered, and the old songs had risen into the night sky that was 15 years ago. Today, the monument still stood, and the ceremony still continued. Human children still learned about the conquest and the war and the long preparation that had made victory possible, but they were also learning something else. They were learning that strength without mercy is cruelty, and cruelty always plants the seeds of its own destruction. The Valori had taught humanity that lesson in the worst possible way. Humanity would never forget it across the galaxy. Species who had heard the story of the human-Valori war drew their own lessons from it. Some learned to fear humanity. Others learned to respect them. A few wise ones learned the truth that Yethvan had discovered after 5 years of study. Do not harm a species that remembers. Do not threaten a species that prepares, and never, ever underestimate a species that refuses to give up. Humanity had waited 10,000 years for justice. They had built everything they had for one single purpose. And when the moment came, they had risen from their knees and taken their place among the stars. The galaxy would never forget what they had accomplished, and humanity would make sure of it. The long memory endured.